The buggy was always facing the same direction by the time church ended. Not because anyone had discussed it that morning, not because I had asked. My husband simply hitched it every single Sunday for 9 years, angled toward his parents' farm instead of mine. I remember the specific sound of it, the creak of the harness, the particular way the horse shifted her weight when she felt the direction settle beneath her. I heard that sound hundreds of times over 9 years, without ever once consciously registering which way we were about to turn. I did not notice the pattern for a very long time. And when I finally did, it told me something about my marriage that I had never let myself see clearly before. My name is Lydia. I was married for 9 years before I finally said something about it. And what I want to tell you tonight is not really about buggies or Sunday visits. It is about how a marriage can quietly decide, without ever discussing it, whose family matters more. Let me explain what an Amish Sunday looked like for us, because the shape of it matters. Every other week, church was held somewhere in our district. The long service, the shared meal after. And on the Sundays in between, when there was no church, families used the day for visiting. This was one of the great rhythms of our life. Cousins seeing cousins, grandparents seeing grandchildren. The entire community stitched together, week after week, through these ordinary Sunday visits. And every single one of those Sunday afternoons, for the first 9 years of my marriage, we went to Eli's parents' farm. I want to be careful here, because I do not want this to sound like a small complaint dressed up as something larger. I loved Eli's family. His mother was kind to me from the very first month of our courtship. His sisters became genuine friends. There was real warmth in those Sunday afternoons, real connection, nothing false about any of it. But my own family lived only 4 miles in the other direction, and in 9 years of marriage, we visited them on a Sunday afternoon perhaps a dozen times total, maybe fewer. I did not notice this imbalance for years. That is the part I find hardest to explain to people now. How does a person fail to notice something happening every single week for nearly a decade? But I think that is exactly how these patterns survive. Not through anyone forcing them loudly, but through such complete consistency that they stop looking like a pattern at all. They start looking like simply the way things are. Has this ever happened to you? Noticing suddenly something that had been true for years, hiding in plain sight simply because it never changed? That is exactly the strange sensation I felt that morning. Not shock at something new, shock at something old, finally coming into focus. The morning I finally noticed was an ordinary Sunday, nothing marking it as different. We were harnessing the horse after church, and Eli turned the buggy, as always, toward his parents' farm, and I found myself watching his hands on the reins with unusual attention, and I thought with a kind of quiet shock, when did we decide this? When did we ever actually decide this at all? We had not. That was the answer that unsettled me most. There had been no conversation, no discussion, no moment where two people had sat down and agreed that his family's Sundays would matter more than mine. It had simply accumulated week after week, decision after undiscussed decision, until 9 years had built themselves into a shape neither of us had consciously chosen. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment, because I think it applies far beyond Sunday buggy rides. How many patterns in any relationship form this way? Not through a single unfair decision, but through the quiet accumulation of 100 small defaults, none of which anyone ever examined closely enough to question? I said something to Eli that evening. Not accusingly. I want to be honest that my first attempt came out softer than what I actually felt, because some of the old training runs deep even in the moment you are trying to push against it. I mentioned, carefully, that I had noticed we had not visited my parents on a Sunday in several months. He looked at me with genuine surprise. And this is the part of the story that changed how I understood everything. He was not defensive. He was not dismissive. He simply had never noticed either. He told me honestly that visiting his own parents had never felt like a decision to him. It had simply felt like what Sunday was for. The thought that this was a choice being made rather than a fact about the world had genuinely never crossed his mind. I believed him. That is important to say. This was not a man deliberately choosing his family over mine. This was a man who had been raised inside a pattern so seamless he had never had to examine it, married to a woman who had been raised inside the same pattern from the other side, trained to accept without question whatever direction the buggy turned. The following Sunday, without much discussion, we visited my parents instead. I remember the drive there with an intensity I still recall clearly. The particular quality of light on the fields, the sound of the wheels on the gravel, my own quiet nervousness, as though I were about to do something far more significant than simply visiting my mother and father. My mother cried a little when we arrived. Not dramatically, just a small, quick brightness in her eyes before she composed herself and went to put the coffee on. And I understood, watching her, that she had noticed the pattern too, for 9 years, and had never once said a word about it. Because saying something felt, in our world, like an accusation against a marriage, and no mother wants to be the reason her daughter's marriage feels accused of anything. I sat in her kitchen that afternoon, in the same chair I had sat in as a girl, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not even known was tight. My father came in from the barn and seemed almost shy about how pleased he was to see us. My younger brother, still living at home, kept finding small reasons to walk through the kitchen just to be near us a little longer. I realized, watching all of this, how much quiet hunger had been sitting in this house for 9 years, waiting patiently, never once demanding to be fed. That single Sunday did not fix 9 years of imbalance. I want to be honest about that. We did not suddenly split our visits perfectly evenly from that day forward. What changed was smaller and, I think, more important. We started actually discussing it. Some Sundays we still went to his parents. Some Sundays we went to mine. But now it was a choice, spoken out loud, made by two people who had finally noticed there was a choice to be made at all. I think about those 9 years often. Not with bitterness. I do not think bitterness would be honest, because nobody in that story was acting with cruelty. I think about it instead as a kind of quiet warning about how easily two people can build an entire shared life around unspoken defaults, defaults that favor one person's family, one person's comfort, one person's version of normal, without either person ever consciously choosing it. I think, too, about all the other unspoken defaults that must have been sitting quietly inside our marriage alongside that one. Patterns I still have not noticed. Decisions still being made by consistency alone rather than by conversation. That thought used to frighten me. Now it simply makes me more attentive. To Eli, to myself, to the small accumulating shapes of our shared life that deserve, every so often, to be looked at directly instead of simply lived inside. I want to ask you something tonight. Is there a pattern in your own relationship, with a partner, with a family, with anyone close to you, that has simply accumulated over time without either of you ever actually sitting down and choosing it? A direction the buggy always turns, so consistently that neither of you has thought to ask why. I am not suggesting every unexamined pattern is unfair. Some patterns deserve to stay exactly as they are. But I believe they deserve, at least once, to be looked at directly. To be named out loud. To become a choice again, instead of simply a habit neither of you remembers building. That is what one ordinary Sunday taught me, after 9 years of buggies turning the same direction, without either of us asking why.